Thank you all for tuning in and welcome again to the Birds and Bees Festival 2021. I'm Zeb Yoko from the Missouri Bird Observatory. I am going to be introducing our speaker, but first I'm going to talk a little bit about the tech. If this is your first session, we are using the Whova platform, but it's a Zoom window. If you have any questions and chat, please put them in the Whova chat. It should be to the right of your window. And if you're looking at it, if you're using a mobile device, I think if you turn it sideways, it'll be easier to see the presentation. But other than that, just sit back and enjoy the presentation. So today, our presenter I'm happy to introduce is Erin Shank. Erin received her master's in wildlife conservation from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, and then worked for Missouri Botanical Garden for several years before her current role as the urban wildlife biologist for the St. Louis region with the Missouri Department of Conservation. She works with communities on conservation projects, often focused on building habitat for the smaller and more measly critters like pollinators, such as what we're going to see in this presentation today. So without any further ado, thank you very much, Erin, for joining us, and go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Zeb. And if questions come into the chat, Zeb, will you let me know? And, or we can do that at the end, because
we'll do questions at the end. There should be time at the end.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, thanks everybody for attending today. Let me see if I can get the slide to advance. Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, just a quick kind of summary of what I'm going to go over today, some basics about pollination, and talking about why our native or our wild bees matter to our agricultural and natural and urban systems. And then we're going to kind of just get into some of the details on Missouri bees and the kind of families of bees that we find here in Missouri. And then we'll talk about what you can do for pollinators. So just a little bit of basics about pollination. That's the physical process of moving pollen from the anthers of the flower to the stigma. So it's the fertilization of those flowers, which leads to fruiting. And so, you know, many of our plants can be pollinated by wind or by water, but about 70 to 75% of the world's plants actually need pollination by an animal, and typically those are insects. And so this includes about 35% of our crop species worldwide that must be pollinated by insects or some sort of animal. And not just the kinds of things that we usually think of, like cherries and apples and almonds, but this also includes alfalfa, for example, which is the main food crop for all of our dairy products. So that really means no bees, no ice cream. So anyways, bees are incredibly important to our food systems. And you've probably seen the statistics. It's pretty popular that 1 out of every 3 bites of your food is thanks to a bee. Well, you can also think of it in terms of not just calories, because that's really referring to the amount of caloric intake that the world, that the human population consumes, but really about 75% of our nutrition comes from bee pollinated or animal pollinated crops. So those are our more colorful and arguably most flavorful foods that are really thanks to largely bee pollinators. Pollination, of course, is important to not just humans and not just our food sources. We know that many of our plants have evolved with very specific relationships with certain bees that can pollinate them, and they cannot flower and fruit without the pollination from those bees. And so just the diversity of our plant systems, which of course in turn support the diversity of animal life, bees are really important to sustaining that. In kind of Doug Tallamy kind of theme as well, and he talks about this usually in his talks, and about the importance of larval insects to songbirds in particular, that those young songbirds rely so heavily on the protein and fat rich insect larvae. And so in that way, you know, pollinators are a direct food source for a lot of our wildlife as well. So just kind of taking a step back, um, there's a diversity of pollinators out there in the insect world. There's butterflies and beetles and flies and wasps. Bees are truly the premier pollinator in our temperate area, and there's a couple reasons for this. First, bees are strict vegetarians. So while wasps may be accidentally pollinating when they are sipping nectar from a flower or feeding on flies and other insects that are visiting those flowers, bees are truly there at the flower for their food source and collecting that pollen and nectar for their young. Which is another reason why they're such good pollinators, is they're highly motivated. They provide for their young, and in the form of nectar and pollen kind of balls that they will stow away in their nest cavities. And I'm gonna show you some pictures in a little bit about of that. So they also regularly forage around where their nests are. There's certainly a range of distance that bees will travel from a female bee from a nest in order to forage for their young, but about 500 meters or so. And with their behavior and providing for their young, they've evolved with all these pollen carrying apparatuses. So their furry bodies and their pollen sacs that they have on their abdomens or their hind legs, they're just very well suited for transporting pollen. So that's really what makes bees our premier pollinators. I'm just going to say one word about honeybees, and then we're just going to leave honeybees behind. So I will not be talking about honeybees today. Honeybees are an introduced species to North America. They're really livestock more than wildlife. So they are very important agriculturally to do a lot of our work on pollination, but they are not actually great pollinators of a lot of our native and crop plants. They're kind of the jack of all trades for pollination, but not nearly as powerful as many of our native bees at pollinating. So for example, the work of, I've heard various numbers on this, but the work of about 50 honeybees is equal to about one of our native bumblebee species that can, as far as the amount of pollen they can transport and the amount of pollination they can do. That said, I'm not downplaying the importance agriculturally or to our economy that honeybees represent, because certainly they are an important part of our agricultural systems, but we're not going to be talking about honeybees today. So worldwide, there's tens of thousands of bee species. In the United States, we have about a little over 4,000 species. And in Missouri, currently, we're at about 454, give or take, species. There's new, don't get too attached to those numbers. There's new bee species described almost every year. In fact, there's a new cactus bee species that is currently being described that was collected at Hughes Mountain in Missouri, so has a real specific relationship to prickly pear. And so, that number ekes up every once in a while, but about 450 species of bees that native bees that we have in Missouri. So just kind of dividing those up roughly into families, we're going to go over each one of these families and some of their characteristics. But the apids are, well, I'll get into more details, but those are generally apids, halictids, megachilids, andrenids, and coletids. So first we have the apids, and these are kind of our most visible bees. They include the bumblebees and the longhorn bees. Carpenter bees are part of this group as well. So many our bumblebee species are social, but many of our native bees are solitary. In fact, about 90% of our native bees are actually solitary, so they're not hive forming. And they don't exhibit that social behavior or that protection of a hive that many people fear as far as being stung. And that's why we talk about our native bees as being more docile and less likely to sting than, say, a honeybee that is protecting a hive with large numbers of bees located within it. However, even though this group does include the bumblebees, many of the bees in this family are actually solitary as well. An example is the squash bee. So this is the Peponapus pruneosa, and it is a very cool species. It's one of my favorite. I'm going to say this. I'm lying to you. I was about to tell you it's one of my favorite bee species, but I'm going to say that for every one of the bee species I tell you about. So it's true. It is one of my favorite species. They have kind of enlarged ocelli at the top of their heads, which you can kind of see in that picture. I'm pointing as if you can see like where I'm pointing on my own screen, but in the larger picture, you can see those ocelli. So they have the two large eyes, and then the bees will have three ocelli, so small, simple eyes at the top of their head. And these are enlarged in the squash bee, which allows them to get to work earlier in the day than, say, our honeybees that have to wait until give or take, 10 a.m. or so to actually wake up and be able to navigate with enough light. So they can navigate in darker conditions. And our squash plants, those flowers open up early in the day. And so oftentimes by the time honeybees, for example, would even wake up, all the pollination for squash flowers that have opened would have already been accomplished by squash bees. So these are, really important agriculturally, but also just historically, when you think of Native Americans living and cultivating native squashes throughout North America, those fruited thanks to the squash bee. Next, we have the megachilids. Megachilid roughly translates into big-lipped or big-mouthed bee. And you can see that the mandibles on these bees, they have enlarged mandibles. And these are leafcutter and mason, resin, leafcutter, what did I say? Mason, carder, and resin bees. So they are solitary cavity nesting bees. So that picture on the right is an example of different types of megachilid nests. So the bottom nest you see is a mason bee, and they will line their nest cavities with mud and then provision each one of those larvae with a pollen nectar ball that larva can feed upon as it develops. Above that, you see a resin bee, so that those bees collect resin from plants to do the same thing, line their nest cavity and divide those. Each one of those divisions is one baby. So they provision each one of those young. And then above that is a leafcutter bee nest. And of course, they use leaves to line their nest. And you can see how they kind of collect that material. In that bottom picture is a carder bee. That's the wool carder bee, and they strip those hairs off of the plant material off of the leaf tissue, and that's what they line their nests with. So megachilids are just super cool in that their behavior is fascinating. The way that they build these nests, they're extremely industrious. They tend to be somewhat large-bodied. Some of them are really almost bumblebee-sized, and so they're incredibly powerful pollinators. One cool thing about megachilids, which I just find fascinating, like evolutionarily, is that they will, when they lay their eggs, they lay they will only nest in cavities that have one opening. So the opening, on this end, and the other end is blocked off. And they will lay their female eggs in the back of that nest and the male eggs towards the front. And if you can kind of remember basic bee biology, females are diploid and males are haploid. Or am I getting that backwards? I always get confused, but females have twice the number of chromosomes than male bees do. And so they can control, which of those eggs are fertilized, and they will lay those females in the back. And then we don't really understand what causes them or how they know when to come out, but it's probably temperature and light dependent. And so those males will come out first, and they'll kind of chew their way out and, head off into the world. But those females are more protected in the back from, predators that might want to get at the larva, or scavengers that are trying to get at that nectar and pollen source. But they're also protected in that those males are going to leave the nest first. And if they leave too early, they might, succumb to cold or weather events, whereas the females will be more protected. I just think that's really fascinating. An example of this is the Osmia lignaria, which I think that scientific name sounds like a Harry Potter spell, doesn't it? Osmia lignaria. I just think it does. And so this is the blue orchard bee, or the notorious BOB. It's an incredibly important pollinator of many of our fruits and nuts. So this is actually a farmed bee. I mean, on larger agricultural operations that are producing fruits and nuts, they will actually bring in blue orchard bees to do that pollination and build structures for them to nest there. It's also really, can I go back? It won't let me go back, but I was gonna say it's a really, conspicuous bee because of the coloring. So this is a fun one if you want to get into like identifying bees and whatnot. It's a really good one to learn first, because there's not a whole lot that looks like it. It's coloration and whatnot. Okay, next we have the sweat bees. I love the sweat bees. This is a humongous family. They called halictids, and the most kind of conspicuous members are that metallic green sweat bee that you see at the top there, and they tend to be very small. They get their name from their habit of sipping the salty sweat off of people, but they rarely actually sting. They're very docile, and I have been stung by sweat bees a number of times just on collection, and it's not a very powerful sting either. So, anyways, some of these are specialist bees, so I haven't really talked as much about that, but some of these bees are what we call oligolectic, which means that they are dependent on specific plants for pollen. It's usually a family of plants like the Claytonia or aster family or something, so that they cannot feed their young anything but that type of pollen. Some of these bees are also capable of something called buzz pollination. And if you've heard of buzz pollination, we typically think that bumblebees are larger bodied bees being able to buzz pollinate, but actually sweat bees, being considerably small, can actually buzz pollinate as well. And that involves them kind of wrapping their abdomen around that flower, or the stamen of that flower, and then they grab it with the mandibles, and they vibrate the muscles they use for their wings. They can kind of decouple that, so that the mandibles and the abdomen actually vibrate that flower to release the pollen. And here's a video. Can you hear it? It's really soft. It's buffering, stinking thing. But you can see here, there it goes. You can see where the pollen, she has packed the pollen onto her legs. See how she's doing that? She's packing it onto her legs, where she's got her scopa, or her pollen carrying baskets. But you can really hear that buzz while she's buzz pollinating that plant. And so that's partridge pea, and it does require buzz pollination. So that's just a video I took down at Hahatonka State Park. Let's see here. Okay, so we already talked about the metallic green sweat bee, but it's just gorgeous. I mean, if you ever get a chance to look at a bee under a specimen scope, look at this one, because it is just so beautiful. It just doesn't even look like it can be real, So this one is found statewide. They do nest in cavities. Many of our native bees are ground nesters, but this one happens to be a cavity nester. Let's see. Oh, I'm like way over time already. Okay. And then we've got our andrenids. So these are our mining bees. They nest underground. And again, you can see their nest cavities where the young are developing on those pollen and nectar balls there. I'm gonna have to go through this kind of quick now because I'm out of time. But an example is the spring beauty bee. This is one of the early emerging pollinators, and it is an obligate of Claytonia. So they actually require Claytonia to provision for their young. The coletids are the plaster bees or polyester bees, and they get that name because of the secretions that they use to line their nests to kind of waterproof them. And it's kind of a cellophane-like lining, which you can see in the picture there. Coletids tend to be specialist bees on plants, and they include these masked bees. So the picture you see there is a fairly easily identifiable coletid there with that yellow mask on the clepeus. Again, these are ground nesting bees, and an example is the Caletes inequalis. This is one that you will see, it's widespread. I live in an urban area in St. Louis, and I see these bees emerge in large numbers this time of year. And it's so exciting because you see these little tiny holes in the dirt where they don't need much access, but just a little open ground, and they will nest in there. And when they emerge, those holes fill in really fast, but on a dry day, you can see a bunch of those. And those are Caletes inequalis coming out of the ground, which is neat. And they can pollinate a wide variety of plants. So a really great early pollinator. So I'm going to finish up talking about things that you can do to help pollinators. And I want to stress that pollination or pollinator conservation is an achievable goal for just the regular homeowner. Anyone who can either plant flowers in a pot or if you have a 40-acre farm, and in anything in between, you can make a meaningful contribution to conservation with regards to pollinators just by doing a few things. And those are what I'm going to go over now. First of all, think about planting native flowers that bloom throughout the year. So early blooming and late blooming, especially when food sources are more scarce, can help pollinators. Lawns are deserts. They are essentially one step up from a parking lot with regards to wildlife in general, but certainly pollinators. So rethinking the use of our yards and our spaces, our green spaces, and at least slowing our mowing and not treating for broadleaf weeds in our yards that we do have. Those can really help bee populations. Avoiding neonicotinoids and other pesticides. So neonicotinoids are systemic pesticides, and so you want to read the label of plants that you buy. The label would say that it's been, I thought I had a picture of that label, but I don't. But the label says that it's been treated for sucking insects, essentially, but those pesticides are systemic and can harm bees as well, because that chemical will be released in the pollen and nectar as well. Like I said, 90% of 90% of our bees are solitary, but 70% of our native bees are ground nesters, and they need some access to the ground. So limiting some of the mulching that you do, not over mulching, and just leaving some bare ground. It doesn't have to be gigantic patches, just even, a couple inches here and there of bare ground so that bees can access and build their nests. Just a word about cavity nesting structures. Those are really popular right now. And you know what, I'll leave this one as, if you have questions about cavity nesting structures, get in touch with me, because they can sometimes do more harm than good. But there are some things to keep in mind with regards to cavity nesting, like these bee boxes and whatnot, that you can do it in a way that is going to offer some beneficial nesting habitat, but avoid some of the pitfalls that can come along with that. So companion planting, you can boost your vegetable production in your own yards, like for tomatoes and peppers and okra and whatnot, by providing some other native forage along with that. And so it's kind of like a win-win situation. Of course, supporting conservation policies and agencies is, I couldn't go without saying that. There are tons of resources out there for more information, and you can, take a picture of this or whatever if you want to, but Grow Native, Xerces, those are at the top of my list, and there's some really wonderful books. The Bees in Your Backyard is one of my favorites, and if you're in for kind of a good semi-deep dive into native bees, Our Native Bees by Paige Embry is a really great read, and an easy, kind of accessible one, not too technical. Okay, so that's all I've got. I know I went over, I apologize for that, and I rushed through some things, but I get really excited about this. And do we have any questions?
We do have one question, and thank you all for sticking around. I probably should have tried to speed you up a little bit, but you were way too excited, and it was way too good of a presentation to rush it anymore. So again, thank you all for sticking around. We will stick around for a couple more minutes for questions, but Erin, the first question we had was from Deborah, and it was asking, are carpenter bees efficient pollinators?
Oh yeah, so not really. So they tend to be more nectar robbers, but they're so large bodied that they do tend to accidentally do quite a bit of pollination just because of that, even though their main motivation in visiting flowers is really to get at that nectar. But so they're not as good as like bumblebees or the other ones that I talked about today. But they are native. That large carpenter bee is a native bee in Missouri.
Excellent. All right, another question did just come in. This question is from Katie. She asked, do male and female young develop at the same rate?
They do, yes. And so, again, we know a little bit more with regards to those cavity nesters than we do with a lot of our ground nesters, simply because it's easier to observe and study them in that nesting environment, but they do develop at the same rate, yes. Although, I guess the caveat is stay tuned, as we are always learning more. There's so much we don't understand about so many of our bee species. And so I think there's still lots of learning to be done, especially in understanding the relationship between the flowers in their bloom times, and as those larvae develop, how do they match their development so precisely to the flowering time of plants that they're dependent upon, or flowers they're dependent upon? That is really a fascinating and somewhat still mysterious phenomenon in nature.
Yeah, I always have to wonder too with those cavity nesters like that, like how many cues can get into that tube for everything to know when to start developing and how to time it. It's amazing.
I know, it really is. It's mind blowing.
Because we do have a couple more questions coming in, okay. So I'll get to those quickly. So this question is also from Katie. I live on the 13th floor. Would it still be beneficial for me to put plants on the balcony at that height?
Yeah, gosh, that's a good question. And I mean, I'm kind of thinking not so much, but I don't really know the answer to that. That is awfully high, and I'd be curious to know if you got any pollinators up there, but I'm thinking you probably wouldn't see much visitation that high up.
Sounds like it could be a cool citizen science project though to set up.
But if you do, let me know. Like if you plant something up there, some native flowers, and you actually see bees visiting those flowers, I'd be interested in knowing that.
That would be super cool. Karen asks, what is the typical range of how far a native bee flies for nectar?
Yeah, the larger bodied bees do tend to fly farther than the smaller bodied bees, but 500 meters or so. So, you know, what that's a little over a quarter of a mile, so not that far. However, again, there's lots we don't know, and it is amazing that, for example, we've done quite a bit of monitoring of bees in the urban area and community gardens, and where there are squash plants planted, so where people are growing their zucchini and pumpkins or gourds or whatever, we find squash bees. It's like, where did they come from? You know, how it's a classic if you build it, they will come scenario. And even if we can't identify something, you know, within that typical range, I don't know, they find their way there. It's really interesting. But generally 500 meters is what we think of as their range for foraging.
Awesome. And I've heard for some of the really small ones, like their home range is basically the size of a football field, so they can be even smaller.
Which is why it actually really matters too what you do. I said this already, but I live in an urban community in St. Louis, and um, you know, we of course we've got our native area, and I live in a postage stamp, but I see such a diversity of bees after a couple of years of our between our vegetable gardening and our wildflower garden. And so it matters even if you don't have a lot of space. It's the kind of conservation you can do on a small scale and make a big difference.
Excellent. I don't see any more questions coming in, so I'm going to put, Erin, I'm going to put your email in the chat so
Okay.
people have it. It should be on your speaker profile, I think, too.
Okay.
So if you do have any questions, and there were a couple of things she said, don't hesitate to reach out for.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll put that in quick, and that should still be available in the chat afterwards. Other than that, thank you all for attending,
Yeah,
and
thanks everyone. Thank you, Zeb.
and enjoy the weekend. And thank you again, Erin.
All right, bye.